And so the rest of the night we're going to be answering 3 questions and just making sure we're all on the same page. Why is it that we gather together in worship? And then how do we gather together in worship? And then what is our role as worship leaders in worship? We want to make sure that we're all on the same page with those 3 questions. So thinking about, again, back to the story of God. If worship does the story of God, and let's think kind of the beginning of God's story. In answering the question, why do we gather together in worship? Why is that important? We could all just stay at home and pray and sing and read the Bible. Like, why is it that we are coming together? So how would you answer that?
I would say to encourage and edify each other.
Okay. So there's something that benefits us as we come together. Mm-hmm. Why else?
Whenever 2 or more are gathered in His name, He's there.
Yeah, God's presence is there. Kind of reminds us of the Old Testament, you know, in the tabernacle and the temple. That's where God was, and so people gathered together there. So we not only are in God's presence, but we're also kind of edifying each other and encouraging one another.
This is a walk we're not meant to walk alone. We are to be in community with each other on this walk, and belong.
Mm-hmm. There's a reason we're called the body of Christ, not just an individual. For sure. Anything else? Why we gather together? I think if we look at like creation itself, like God does the work. God created, God called everything into being, and then most of God's work throughout the Old Testament is never in just one people, one person. It's usually one person in a community, and most of His work happens in community in some kind. So this idea of us not meaning to be alone, we glorify God and we encourage one another. And so we have yet to, put our worship services online or anything like that. And who knows if we'll do that one day, but that's one of the things that I think at Crossroads, no, we do really value actually coming and being together in worship on a Sunday morning. That's why we come. Give God glory, be in His presence, and encourage one another. How do we gather for worship? And so in this way, we're going to use the word, the word liturgy. And I'm going to give you a handout here. There's a bunch on the back, there's like just little random quotes that you'll recognize me saying if you'd pass these around. One of the first quotes on the top of the back page is from Peter Leithart. He says, liturgy is the structure of a church's worship service. We all have some kind of liturgy, even if we don't use that word. How we structure our worship service is our liturgy. And then another author that I read a lot of, he wrote a great book called Christ-Centered Worship. He says, and the liturgy tells a story. Kind of goes along with Robert Weber's worship does God's story. Liturgy in itself tells a story. We tell the gospel by the way that we worship. And hopefully in our worship, we're not only telling the gospel, but we're actually doing it. Throughout the centuries, the church has been identifying elements that belong in worship, trying to figure out what should we be doing in worship. And there's been what Brian Chappell called a gospel pattern. If they looked back in centuries, there's this pattern of what was happening in worship services that most churches were doing, and it seemed to transcend time, culture, preferences, and they said this is, and so if you look on the back, he said this is the structure of the liturgy that tells the story. And through the centuries, as this gospel pattern has been figured out, there's been 4 big sections that have been in worship services, and the Presbyterians in the Book of Order call, and you can see this on one side of your paper. It starts with gathering, and it goes to proclaiming, and then it goes to responding, and it goes to sending. And this has been helpful. These 4 big sections in our worship service, in a grand way, tell God's story. If you think about starting with gathering, it's that God calls us to Him. If you think about proclaiming, He then gives a word, gives truth. And then if we think about responding, we respond to that truth. And then in sending, there's always a part in God's story where He's saying, now go and tell. And so that's like the macro version of God's story. But then these little elements of worship that were bullet pointed fit into these big things. And Todd and I, with the pastors, when someone says, hey, can we do fill in the blank in worship? What we do is we use these big four and we think, well, does it fit? Does it fit into one of these four? And if it does, then we use those big four to help decide, well, where best should it fit? And if it doesn't fit in any of those, we feel confident that we can go to the person who asked and say, no, actually that's not something that fits into a worship service. Maybe it will fit into the life of Crossroads somewhere else, but it's not going to fit into worship. I heard a professor describe these four ways as it's kind of what we do. Imagine somebody coming to your house. And when someone comes to your house, what's the first thing you do? You greet them. You gather them in. You bring them to where the main activity is happening. And then you have kind of the main event. Some kind of like the reason you're here could be a meal or a meeting or a gathering, but there's some kind of main message happening, and then there's responding in some way. Oftentimes when someone's coming to your house, there's food involved, and so there's some kind of response. But then there's also a time when you're like, okay, we're done. And you dismiss them or you send them out. He said it's so the story of what we do, and it's the story of how God interacts with us. And so that's how Robert E. Weber can say worship does the story of God, or that Lightheart says liturgy tells this gospel story. There's another author that we read, Leonard Sweet. He's written a gazillion books, but one of the things when he was talking about worship is he says this part of worship, these things that we've just talked about, this is what he would call the content. These are non-negotiables. This is just the elements that should be in worship. If you're missing one of these, no, these are the must-haves. These are the content. And so we, as in our worship service, we try in throughout the year to make sure all of these things are in our worship services. But then he says where it's kind of general. Like we don't have words to the prayer of confession yet. How are we going to respond? Or what are you going to say in the call to worship? Now you start getting into the specifics where our role as worship leaders start to be involved. And he says these things, the creative things, the how you get the message across, Leonard Sweet calls the container. And he says, and that's where sometimes the church gets a little upset. Where if you spend too much concentration, if you concentrate too much on the container of how the message gets across, that's not the point. The point is the content. The content is the main thing. On the back of your page, there's a quote that I was like, ooh, Leonard, yikes. He says, every generation needs a shape that fits into its own hands, its own soul. Each generation, every person, needs a different handle from which to receive the living waters of Jesus. Our task is to pour the living water into anything anyone will pick up. And he says, by anything, I mean that literally, anything. If I want to reach my 22nd century children with the gospel of Jesus, I must be prepared to pour the living water into containers out of which, frankly, myself would never be caught dead drinking. I was like, oh, because this is so often where the church gets hung up, right? This is where our differences of opinion about the container cause division. Don't get me wrong, I think the container is important because if our container isn't well fitting, the content can be absolutely lost. But the container is not the main reason we are here. This story of God is why we are here. And so it must be pointed out that we as worship leaders are part of the container. We are not why anybody is there. And so everything that we do has to be to focus everybody on the content and not on our container. So the rest of our time is going to be talking about what we as worship leaders can do to make sure that we don't ever become the focus and we always keep the focus on the content. So let's get into particulars. The things that we will do as leaders in worship. We are going to be saying prayers, we're going to be singing lyrics, we're going to be proclaiming scripture, all of those things, kind of common sense. That needs to be clear. It needs to be in tune. We want to make sure what we're saying and doing is meaningful. We're going to be talking about the volume that we speak at, the rate of speech that we use, the inflections that we give. And so we're going to do some practical reading of a call to worship and a prayer of confession. So these are words that have been said before in a worship service. And so we're going to look through them and have you practice them. And I'd like you to practice it two ways. One way, like, how would I say this really well? And then how could I really seriously do this badly? Have a little fun of like, and you could have it be, again, think of volume. I could be too soft. I could be way too loud. Or I could be way too fast. Or I could be so slow that we just haven't the faintest idea what you said a minute ago. You know, like I have no idea. And then the inflection, like the words you choose to emphasize could be like spot on and make it me so meaningful, and then total opposite ways of like, and you sound ridiculous. And so you can go in that way of how you want to butcher it or how you want to do it well. And on the back is a prayer of confession, and we'll do that first. But first I want you to concentrate on the call to worship. And so,
Lord, be with you.
And also with you.
Our God is the God of creation, greater than all those things that fill us with fear and dread.
And aren't we all just in pain right now? We're like, oh my gosh, like, come on. So did you understand what she was saying? No, not really. So again, that's one of those, like, the container got in the way of the content.
Like you said, she needs help.
Seriously, you're like, why did they let her do this? You know, like, why did she, right. So like, hello. So right, you're like, oh man. So that's just a way, like, do.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Our God is the God of creation, greater than all those things that fill us with fear and dread. God is God in the whirlwind of everyday life, our comforter in the midst of the storm. Let us come and worship the God whose still, small voice can calm the raging seas and speak peace into our lives, our homes, our communities, and our world. Please rise as you are able and join us in this hymn of praise.
I liked how both the guys slowed down on still, small voice. I mean, it naturally happens that way, and you guys let it naturally happen that way. So flip your page over. Same worship service, but now you as the worship leader have to switch gears a little bit because we're going into a prayer of confession. Still, we would say at Crossroads that where we fit it often is up in the gathering. As Mark said, we come in, we acknowledge who God is, and then very quickly we realize, oh, and then there's me. And Lord, this is what I need. And then oftentimes we will do the assurance and the peace right after that to kind of remind us that we belong to God, and now we are ready to hear the word proclaimed. So here we've just come off of kind of adoration, something like that, and it's that time where, okay, we just need to remember who we are. So how will your volume change? What would be an idea between what you did at Call to Worship and now what you're doing for Prayer of Confession?
Not as loud.
Probably not as loud. Okay? I'm not going to go whispering quite as much as Dawn did, but maybe not as loud. Okay? And what would you do rate of speech? Like how fast would you go? What could be different between Call to Worship versus...
A
little slower, a little less excitement.
Slower, absolutely, yeah. Slower is going to be important, absolutely, to be understandable. And inflection is going to be the same. You're going to want to find those words. Oftentimes, there is some kind of transition statement between, because usually there's been a song that we've just sung, and so suddenly to go, and now let's pray. Oh dear God, that's it's a little whiplash. And so we like to have some kind of call to confession is what we call it. Some kind of transition statement that takes us from this is how God is awesome and we acknowledge that maybe we're not. And so let's pray together. And it's not just my prayer to God, but I am praying on behalf of everybody around me. So I can't get super quiet and personal, and we try in the words that we speak to not make it too much like, ooh, this is Jenee's prayer, not necessarily all of Crossroads prayer. So, John, do you want to do it well or badly?
Do it badly, I guess.
Okay, you have to stand.
I know.
You can do it badly and stand.
You could stand on one leg. That would be badly.
What are you doing?
He's going to make you on the camera.
Cut off your head. Cut off your head, that's fine.
I'll do badly.
Our great God is great and powerful and always with us. Let's bow before Him now to confess our sins and to ask for His forgiveness. Let us pray.
Wow, dude.
You got a bite yourself.
That's right. Everybody's like, whoa. That's right. You've been like, right. Too much of an announcement. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Like now I'm in the middle of a, yeah.
I'm on for the second, right?
Yeah, that's going to be perfect how you do that. That'll be great. Advent, here comes John. Yeah. You'll be like, wait. But isn't that funny when you tell some people to be loud? We'll make sure we can hear you. Be strong. Whoa. There can be a time when they go overboard in the volume level. And again, we have no idea what you just said because we're starting to giggle. We're like, oh my gosh. Like, God is great. Got it. Now we're going to pray. No, we're not. Actually, we're all going to just back up a few snots. So, again, content got lost. Mark? So in this way, this is one way that we, as the worship leader, are part of the container. We want to make sure, but we are not always the only part of the container. So other elements to consider are microphone and sound system, walking, standing, sitting transitions, and clothing. And so we can imagine microphone issues. I'm sure we've all seen this, where someone's trying to talk and they're holding the microphone over here. Okay, talk about content being lost, right? And so, so one of the things we want to make sure is that we know how to use a microphone well, that we're speaking into it naturally, and so that's going to be a huge thing that we make sure we're all trained on and comfortable with. And so how would you think, you guys have all been a part of this, why is it that we care so much about walking, sitting, standing? How is that a part of the container? And think about telling a story. Like when you're just a part of the story, usually if you're in a play or something like that, you know what comes before and you know what comes after. And so as part of our job, why we care so much about where you're going to sit and then when you're going to stand and when you're going to move, why that also is a part of it all is because if the big story is the whole liturgy of the morning, we want to make sure you know where my part fits in so that I can nicely just go click like a puzzle piece and not have to be like, is it me? Am I now? Should I go up? And you're like, yes, it is you. And so, there are times we try with the pastors, and of course, there's always times when we're like, Chris, it's you. And he's like, oh, sorry, and then he goes up. And so, we're it's not we want perfection or anything like that, but it is that nice, like, gosh, if we can just do it well and you know what comes before you, so then of course you go up and you do it and ta-da. Again, content then gets the front and center and not the fact that, did you see when they screwed up this morning? And why we do it is not because we're control freaks and because, we must tell everybody what to do. I was like, no, that's exactly right. It's because we're telling the story and we just want it to be seamless. So again, that we are not what they're paying attention to, but it is the words and the whole morning service. That's what, and I feel like that's how Crossroads does it. And that is just, it's become part of our culture. And like, this is just, how do we worship? Yes, we worship as a Presbyterian. We do these fourfold, but these little things are also like, this is kind of how we roll. Like, this is the way. So if you want to come in and be a part of our worship ministry, these are the things you're going to have to know how to do. Down to the last thing is clothing, like down to being concerned about clothing, and not necessarily, I mean, modesty is beautiful, but also like the microphones that we use. One of the things every Sunday I have to be aware of are my earrings because of the kind of microphone I use. And so what I don't want is for me to be singing away and you hear clunk, clunk, clunk. That has happened to me once. And only once. And so what I'm aware of is like, oh my gosh, that's right. What earrings am I wearing? Because I don't want that to be distracting. If you have to use a lapel microphone like this, so often we get to a children's message person and the sound guys are like, you don't have a lapel. And you're like, oh, shoot. And so just being aware of now that we have our in-ear microphones and that you're wearing a pack, like for us girls, like wearing a dress, it's out. Like, sorry, I need pockets. We need pockets of some kind, a blazer or something. So, I mean, even those little distinctions where, sure, we always say, please don't show a lot of skin and make sure you're modest in that regard. But also just little technical wise of being aware of our surroundings and what we knew. How can my clothing be helpful to my situation?
Or even, not me per se, but hair.
Yes.
Hair can be a thing if you're messing with it, if you're playing with it.
Do you remember a pastor?
I remember. I know exactly what.
Yes.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And didn't there was a pastor, and like the whole time, and so did we pay any attention to what she was saying? No, we just thought, poor lady, she needs a barrette.
And there was feedback from the congregation about
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, boy, could we just get her, and like, really? You've never done that before? But again, at Crossroads, if it was a guest pastor, weren't here a lot, our microphones that we use, I mean, it just is one of those things where you're like, it really does matter, because then, I'll preach it for a while, but the content gets lost, and that's not what we want. So as much as some people hate to compare it, but I think our preparation as worship leaders is very similar to an actress who's a stage performer, because they are so prepared, they're so aware of all the things that come at their props, their movements, what they do, their preparation. So what we are going to continue to expect and start really saying, no. I mean, we could probably be a little better at, don't just read these things, but have it practically memorized so that it comes a little more naturally to you. We want to make sure that whatever words you say, you are practicing them out loud so that you get these inflections, so that you get your rate of speech well, you get your volume correct. We want all that preparation before you come on Sunday so that you're there to be able to tell the story. And we have an important story to tell, and we want to make sure that it's told well.
And when a story is told well, it is more impactful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've all seen it done well and think, oh, that was wonderful. And we've seen it done not well, where we've been yelled at in the prayer. People are like, so there. So something that we're going to be saying to all of our worship leaders going forward as the worship ministry team, you're going to be assigned, and many of you already know this, you'll be assigned as a worship leader, or we call them liturgist, on a Sunday. You're going to be sent your text the week before that Sunday, and your responsibility is to look it over, to ask any clarifying questions from us. And on that Sunday, you're going to arrive 30 minutes before so that you can do a sound check with the sound guys. You'll know what mic to use. There are times, and we've done this as worship leaders, where what you do is going to have to coordinate with the media shout guy. So a full run through is going to be necessary so that we make sure you and the guy in the back is doing everything together. We desire that our church be in a right relationship with God and please Him in all that we do. We want there to be full participation from the congregation during worship, and we love it when all the generations are involved. We want the congregation to gather together in worship acknowledging God's presence in the world and in our lives. We want the congregation to respond to the redemptive acts of Jesus Christ, and in so doing be transformed and empowered and renewed and equipped to go out and serve God in the world. We value your role in leading here at Crossroads. We want these kinds of worship experiences to bring hope, and we want you to continue to be a part of this important work. Remember that you are loved. Thank you very much.